Okay, well, nice to be back in front of you all again. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a more specific element of the probity problem, the corruption problem. But just by way of introduction, there are often three things people say to me about corruption. That it's a developing country problem, there aren't any real losers, and anyway, you can't do anything about it, it's a fact of life. And I think all of those three things, which are commonly said, are complete fallacies. And just to tell you about, as you well know, it's not a developing country problem, it's everybody's problem. I live in Austria, which is often viewed as, you know, close to Germany and Norway and so on. But if you would like to hear or read a little bit more about what goes on in Austria, there's an English language version of Der Spiegel magazine, and it has a very interesting piece available on the web called Corruption Scandals in Austria, a web of sleaze in elegant Vienna. 3 pages, summarises all sorts of problems, which are essentially the political elite, legal lobbying, and sacks of cash being handed over in one of Vienna's markets. It's very, very interesting, but it's all about big political elite lobbying. It's not little petty corruption. And it's interesting because it makes you stop and think it happens everywhere. There is a problem everywhere. And I should actually say the Austria doesn't have a proper freedom of information law either. Maybe because it's next door to Italy, we're taking a view there. But they're thinking of introducing one. But what about the losers? I have some figures, again, Frank chose so OECD figures. I have some similar figures. They're not quite the same, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's 9 billion or 10 billion or 2 billion or 3 billion. It's an enormous amount of money that gets diverted. But what does that actually mean? Who actually suffers? Well, we suffer as taxpayers, obviously, but particularly in the developing country context, it's the most disadvantaged in society because it's those projects that don't work. So those that we really should be trying to help and bring up, they're the ones who suffer the most. And they pay directly for all of that because they don't get the very basic services that many of them need. And what about nothing can be done? Well, Frank's just shown the importance of transparency as a tool for this. And I'm going to look at that generally because corruption and collusion, in addition, they don't just mean there's less competition, and so we know the results of that. Things are more expensive, you get projects you don't need, you get reduced quality. But today's been about innovation. And if you don't have to compete because there's corruption or because there's collusion or whatever it is, there's really no incentive from the supplier side to innovate because you don't need to show anything better than the others, you can just bribe your way out. So it's a really pernicious thing that we need to look into. And as Frank says, transparency is a really important tool. And a US judge actually called it the best sunlight, the best of disinfectants. It's a common comment. Transparency is important. Corruption thrives in the dark. However, and there's a huge however here, there's a movement against some elements of transparency in the fight against collusion in particular. And Albert's written about this. What they're saying is that in the context of collusion, which is bidders getting together in a group, operating like a cartel, agreeing not to compete in a load of whole different ways, not submitting a bid or submitting an artificial bid or agreeing to repatriate profits among themselves or whatever it is, that this type of collusion, which is corruption in the sense of distorting the market, is actually facilitated by transparency. And there have been some recent EU cases led by a group called Evrapiki Dynamiki, which is a very well-known Greek litigant in public procurement. And in some recent cases, they were talking about actually the need to reduce information about bidders' identities, about their bids, about the process, in order to try and prevent collusion. The idea is to make the information available less information available so that it becomes more difficult to rig the market. Now that fills me with horror because what does that open the door to? Hiding all sorts of other things underneath the guise of trying to reduce collusion. And apart from anything else, I'm a pro-competition person. And so if you don't give out the best information, you won't get the best bids in the next time. So it raises, to me, a real big policy issue. I think it's critical that we do think properly about the transparency question and avoid any knee-jerk policy reactions. And the OECD has talked about the reality of collusion. And what they have said, and I think there's a lot of truth in this, that we don't really know what information it actually is that really facilitates this collusion. Now, Gianluigi is going to talk about these sorts of things in much more detail. He's an economist, and I'm just going to talk very generally about these things. I don't know what it really is that will help facilitate collusion, what sort of information could do that. But I'm not convinced, and I have absolutely no justification for this whatsoever, other than a numbers game. If there's only 3 or 4 bidders in the market, they know each other. They don't need the procurement system to talk to each other. They'll do so anyway. So one of the things that I get worried about in procurement is the creation of a sort of cartel type situation in the types of things we do in procurement. So think about what are very popular now, framework agreements, and Gianluigi and I are writing about them. You can create the opportunity for a cartel if you don't get your framework agreement right. So there really are steps that can make a difference one way or the other. And I think today we don't have time now to go into all of the details, but I do think the idea of proper procurement planning and really looking very carefully at your market and at the risk to competition in the market is really, really important. And I believe in transparency. And I also believe that we can go a lot further in transparency. I worked last year with a link to the open data situation. I worked last year with a group in Washington called the Center for Global Development. And they're actually pushing, and they've published a paper on publishing government contracts. Not just the procurement information, the contracts. And not only the contracts, but the amendments to the contracts. Because when can you really see if something goes wrong? At the end, when you get the final bill. And all of the usual problems were raised in that discussion. Oh, you can't publish the information. It's full of confidential business information. The suppliers won't have it. And they looked at some jurisdictions where this had happened, including one of the states in Australia, and there really wasn't a problem. There was very little that needed to be hidden for these real confidentiality reasons. There were all sorts of things that people wanted to be hidden for embarrassment reasons, but I don't view embarrassment as a good justification for hiding things. So I think we can go on well in the fight against collusion and corruption using transparency, but we've got to be very thoughtful about how we do it and make sure we really publish the right things. The other thing I'd like to add to that is what happens if you stop having this degree of transparency, or if you're wanting your procurement officials, along with all the other things we talked about that you need to do this morning, we want you to detect corruption. We want to detect collusion. We need whistleblowers, but particularly in the collusion situation, it's actually very, very difficult. You've got to spot the corruption. You've got to spot the collusion. What tools do you have to do that? Generally, you need someone who's involved to blow the whistle, or some red flag. So you've got to be looking for these things, or you've got to have a leniency or a whistleblower program. And what we found in the procurement context is that in a lot of situations, whistleblowing and leniency, there's very little incentive, particularly in the collusion side of things, because the cartels remain quite stable in a procurement situation, because the market is well defined and all sorts of other economic reasons. So we have a problem in terms of finding this information, except that what I might call the internal transparency, the sort of thing that Frank was talking about that the Americans make available, they're much more detailed record of the procurement itself, because that starts getting people to see what the situation should look like. But if you're a cartel running a collusive ring, in a complex procurement in particular, you've got to be able to talk to each other, and people tend to keep records. So you can find those records. They do actually exist. And so the documentation side of things can help us. A well-trained, well-resourced public official might be able to find this information, at least know where to look for it. And I think that's incentivizing people to do that is a really important aspect of the fight against corruption, a practical one. I hesitate to suggest that should be within procurement officials' remits because you've got enough other things going on to do. But somehow we need to think about spotting the corruption in a better way than hoping that somebody comes to Frank's office and blows the whistle. Because it's fantastic when they do, but the incentive on them generally isn't to do it. I mean, in a procurement official's situation, you're not incentivized to look for these sorts of problems. You're incentivized to get a really good deal against the market price and be efficient in doing so. And so holding things up while you sort of start looking for something that may be a problem is difficult, is very difficult. So who can we get to do this? If we have some people like Frank's office, how can we support them? What can we do to encourage people to come forward? What can we do to encourage documentation and data and so on to be used in a way that you can spot problems? I don't have an answer for that actually, but I think it's a question that we need to be looking at. Going back to Austria, and just to finish on this note, they had a prosecution in Vorarlberg, which is a part of Austria, which is basically part of Switzerland really, but politically it's not. And the judge looked into this and he dismissed all the charges because the politicians said, well, we haven't got any records, we don't know what's going on, no, we don't know. And he actually said, well, we know this thing stinks, but it doesn't stink enough because we haven't got enough proof of why it stinks. And he just chucked the whole thing out. We know there were papers behind there somewhere, but we didn't find them. Nobody was really producing them. And so we had a real problem in trying to detect this particular, enough to convict the people concerned, who now hang around in the nice bars in the ski resorts in Vorarlberg, living off the ill-gotten gains that they had. So I don't have any more really to fantastic solutions to offer to you. I wish I did. But I'd like to ask everybody here to think about what might help us support offices like Frank's, because they need that support, because finding corruption without that outside influence, people being willing to report it, is almost impossible in the context of day-to-day procurement transactions. Thanks very much.